I work with, yes, a non-profit. This is part of our team, showing there the famous natty dress sense, which makes Britain the centre of the world fashion industry. And I guess if we have a niche, our niche is trying to work with new audiences and find new ways of talking. So we're constantly looking out for where the new opportunities might be. And what I'm going to talk about now is some of my work and my ideas over the last 10 years on climate change denial and psychology, and also where maybe the opportunities lie for working. I'm going to talk a bit about the British situation and also some of the very interesting debate which is happening within Britain about how do we message climate change. And then for the final third, I'm going to talk very specifically about the experience of our Welsh program, which I think is genuinely exciting. I hope will be interesting. One of the things I want to say is this. This has been very sort of fundamental to the way that we work as an organization. Also, my own life experience has kind of tended me towards this. I had when I was in university, I was always on, or indeed most of my life, I've actually been on the fringe of things. I've been both worked for government consultancies, but also worked for campaign organizations working against the government. I've done direct action campaigning, but I've also done high-level policy work. At university, I got thrown out of the environmental green group at my university because they thought that I was an extreme left infiltrator. Now, however, the International Socialists, which I was also a member of, threw me out, or actually stopped telling me where the meetings were because they thought I was an extreme environmental infiltrator. I tell you the truth. What neither of them knew was, in fact, I was also at that time a card-carrying member of the Conservative Party. Possibly the only person in the country who could say they were involved with all of these things at the same time. So, when you come into the States and you have like a visa waiver form, I'm always thinking, how do I fill this thing in? It's like, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And there's this thing like saying, have you ever been responsible for acts of gross moral turpitude? And I kind of think maybe being a member of the Thatcher's Conservative Party may qualify me for gross moral turpitude. But it does mean I've got this experience in these different networks. I'm very keenly aware of how they interrelate and how they work together, and actually how important the crossover is between them. And this is one of our themes, is how can we get different groups of people talking to each other and exploring what happens in the interface. I mean, there's an ecological equivalence, isn't there, of the boundary condition. Very interesting things happen ecologically between two ecological zones. All of these different organizations I've worked with, all the different approaches worked with over the years, have their own idea and their own narratives of change. We're all about change. All of us here are about change in various ways. How do we make change? What makes that happen? But there are so many different theories of change. And what's interesting about all of the different groups I've worked with is they all have a theory of change that puts themselves very firmly in the middle of the narrative. They have a storyline which is that they are the heroes. I worked for several years for Greenpeace. And believe you me, Greenpeace has an internal mythology in which Greenpeace is the one that saves the world. But all organizations and all groups tend to do this. And they tend to have this, and then the other people are at most bit players. However, the one thing I think which is really clear from any analysis of change and how change happens is that it is not from any single cause. Complex, multifactorial, there's a kind of magic there, we're not quite sure how it happens, multi-causal, and that it comes from a spectrum of actors and actions. And I say spectrums, that's very important. Not just a bunch of people, but actually a whole range of people working in different ways. People who are working in a confrontational way, people who are working in a cooperative way, people who are coming from different ideologies, different political backgrounds, people who maybe have very different worldviews. And that is, again, why if we're going to have action or movement on climate change, it is crucial that we understand that spectrum and that we try and fill in the places, which is, again, why one of the things which is guiding our work in Wales, and indeed everything, is how can we identify constituencies that have currently been rather missed out or ignored. Now, there's a problem with climate change, which is that the worldviews for groups that have been dominating climate change and have been leading the discourse, leading the language, the images we use, are very largely from environmentalism or from climate science, both of which have very much their own internal worldview and their own way of looking at things. And I think we underestimate how powerful that has been in terms of shaping the narrative and way that we talk about climate change. It is still astonishing to me that climate change is framed in terms of polar bears and a melting Arctic, which is a set of images, of kind of like a semiotics, which comes very much from the environmental movement. I remember when we were trying to save British Columbia within Greenpeace, or the forests in British Columbia, we all got together and said, how do we sell British Columbia to people? Let's put a bear in it. And we called it the Great Bear Rainforest. In fact, they keep doing this. They've got to, like it's almost a mantra. You've got to put a bear in, because bears are things which appeal to Greenpeace members. But of course, when you do that, you're actually drawing a line around it, and you're very clearly flagging up that it's that kind of issue for those kinds of people. There are major, major constituencies that have been absent from climate change and the climate change discussion. And this is a source of great concern in terms of how we make political and social progress on this issue. I don't know why This was a motivating question that we've been exploring for years, and I think is one of the most important ones. There are, of course, many organizations that are not involved with climate change because it's peripheral to their concerns. But let's talk about progressive organizations that have been historically at the forefront of political social change, progressive in the sense that they have a very strong sense of social justice and so on. Where are they and where have they been on this issue? Why are they still so poorly represented? It's a question which is absolutely critical for us producing change if we're going to reflect all of those points along the spectrum. I did the first thing which got me working on this was a piece of research I did some 5 years ago, in which I looked at the mentions of the phrase climate change on the websites of social rights organizations. There's a list of them there. And this was a number of times that, climate change was at that point mentioned on the website. Amnesty International, the world's largest, highest profile human rights organization, in 2006 had not one single mention of climate change anywhere on its website, which is truly astonishing. Now, words, phrases tend to appear randomly on websites anyway. I mean, the Amnesty site is huge. So I thought of a control term that by rights should have nothing to do with their core concerns. And what I came up with was ice cream, when I did a search for the phrase ice cream on the websites of these organizations. Yes, you get my drift. Human Rights Watch very, very concerned about the rights of ice cream. I don't know what goes on in Refugees International. This is, of course, climate change, of course, as being the leading cause of future conflict. Even all the refugee organizations and refugee research accepts that it's going to be a major source of refugees. Indeed, some people, Red Cross, already claiming that it's the leading single cause of displacement. I went and did interviews with leading people in these organizations to try to get to the bottom of what was going on, and there were many things going on. One of the things that was going on was that they weren't sure that this is what they worked on. They thought that climate change was an environmental issue. You see, that demarcation environment had already actually tainted their association with it. It's also something that fitted it was a very hard fit within their worldview. And many of the individuals in the organizations, when you actually spoke to them, you realized their worldview, their politics had been shaped without climate change having a ready place in it. So they were concerned with gender issues, they were concerned obviously with human rights, they were concerned with racism. They didn't really have space there at the table for another issue. But I think what was especially interesting is not that they were finding it hard to deal with climate change, but that, as this is showing, climate change was being actively excluded from what was happening on their websites and materials. In other words, ice cream, this rogue phrase, could wander in, but this strongly suggests that actually climate change was being actively excluded. And this is one of the things which I think is very interesting around climate change, is this notion that people exclude climate change from what it is appropriate to talk about within their arenas. I mean, we've been talking a lot about climate change deniers and skeptics, but they are people who, after all, are very actively involved in a discussion. This is a situation where people actively exclude something. Karen Norgard, I don't know, has she ever been to any of these sessions? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, her work has been excellent. Her book is very good. I became aware of this first paper she wrote here, in which, based on research in Norway, she was showing how climate change was being actively excluded from what she called the norms of attention. That's to say, in interviews, people would say, yes, they know climate change is a problem, but it was never appearing in any conversations. It was not something that was actually in any way front of mind or part of a discussion. Now, what was very interesting to me when I read this was it tallied very strongly with another piece of work I'd been doing, which was a comparison between climate change denial and human rights denial. Ironically, human rights, because as we've just said, what appeared to be happening within human rights organizations was it was being excluded from the norms of attention. So Stanley Cohen has specialized, I mean, he's spent 10, 20 years on it now, working on denial of human rights atrocities. And what you'll see is interesting is that he is saying exactly the same thing about the process by which people know about a human rights atrocity. They know that people are disappearing in the night. They hear the trucks coming and taking people off in the night. But there is not a public acknowledgement. And this has come out very, very strongly in a kind of historical analysis of Holocaust, for example, that there was this extent to which there was a complicit agreement to suppress it. This is another thing which is a major concern. How, in terms of our public engagement, do we move climate change from a position where it is actually pushed to one side and it is marginal to people's attention to bring it front of mind? We've heard about the opinion poll research, which goes out and says, I'm very concerned about climate change. But I think there's a major flaw in that, which is, I think that people know that that's the right answer to say when they're asked, are you concerned about climate change? However, that does not mean that climate change figures in any significant way in their day-to-day decisions, which is a different piece of research. So just, indeed, as Kari Norgard found, when she went and asked people in her sample area in Norway, are you concerned about climate change? They'd say, yes, very much. Do you ever talk about it? When was the last time you talked about it? No one could remember when they last talked about it. So there's this degree of compartmentalizing. I want to go back for a minute to this issue of different cultures of environment organizations, scientists, climate scientists, and what happens in this border territory between the two when the two come together. I sit on the grant-making body of the main British government funder for climate science. They brought me in fact I actually asked to be in, I thought it would be very interesting, in what they call their knowledge exchange program. So they actively want to bring in people from different disciplines and different ideas. So the last session I was at, this is very much on my mind, so I'm kind of trying to work it out at the moment. This was going back, 2 months. We had a large number of projects with grants, quite substantial grants to go through. Most of these were concerned with climate change impacts, climate change adaptation, looking at actually quite serious impacts, especially in the natural world. That accounted for about half of the proposals. Of the others, about half of them were concerned with putting people on secondment within oil companies. Not just that, but many of those were concerned with putting people on secondment in oil companies to do research that was directly related to the expansion of oil exploration. Okay, so it would be, for example, paleontologists or geologists working with them. One was working for BP in the Gulf of Mexico. So BP made, what, $20 billion last year. British government money going towards funding researchers to help them find more oil in the Gulf of Mexico. Similarly, in the Caspian, research in expanding oil production in Africa. So I was in this very uncomfortable situation, and there I am. They've brought me in to do knowledge exchange. They want to explore this interface between different disciplines. There I am sitting in this group with everybody else there as a professor, and all very grown up. I'm still a bit of a kid, and they're all very sensible, strict, kind of stiff kind of people. Saying, well, excuse me, hang on a second. Am I the only one who has a slight reservation about the fact that we appear to be funding work on climate change? We also appear to be funding the expansion of the key cause of climate change. And I said, listen, I'm not saying that because I'm taking a radical green stance. Of course, as we know with language, once you say you're not doing something, as we heard in one of the presentations this afternoon, you immediately make that front of mind. That's what they remember. Go, oh, he's that radical green. But you say, I'm not, look, I said, never mind about the issues whether you think we should be funding this or not. I said, is it not nonetheless curious that we are in this situation? And is this not something that maybe should be in some way covered by our policy? Because many of you, of course, are psychologists. I'm not. I'm not trained as a psychologist, but as a psychologist, it's a very interesting piece of research, how do they square these two things. What was interesting about that interaction, can I say, first of all, what was interesting about it was, oh boy, social norm pressure. Like, it is so powerful. To do that took an awful lot more nerve than doing what I'm doing now, or chaining myself to trees, or any of the other mad things I've done. I mean, it's like very, very hard to do things where you know you're up against the norm so powerfully. But what was most interesting was nobody said anything. Now, I think it's a very interesting question that I'd ask, actually. Not a word. And they were just like, I'm sat there, fused. And I thought maybe during a break someone would say, well, that's a very interesting point. But they didn't say anything. There wasn't an argument for why it was defensible. There wasn't an argument for why it wasn't defensible. There wasn't an argument for why it's policy. The best I could get from people was to say, well, the proposals are perfectly sound science. Interesting. Well, this opens up a whole lot of issues of what constitutes sound or unsound science. But I did say to them, well, if we were doing medical research funding and we had a grant proposal from a tobacco company that was seeking to expand sales of cigarettes, would that be considered fundable if nonetheless the criteria of it met the criteria of sound science? This is why I'm not sure I'm going to be invited back on this panel. This is what happens at the interface. This is why the interface between different disciplines gets very interesting. I'm going to pose you a little question too, which is related to this, which is a similar thing. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little challenge related to the same thing. I don't want you now to think in terms of whether this is your own personal response to this, your own emotional response. In a way, I'm much more interested by your intellectual response to the question. And the question is this. Okay. Right. Now, if you, of course, put on your simultaneous translation English headsets, you'll understand that rather a lot is might need a little bit of translation. This, to me, is a very interesting question. It's something which I go around asking a lot of people. I've been asking people here. I'm interested in people's flying patterns. There is, I think, an area in which this is regarded as beyond the norms of attention for many of the people working in this field. There are many reasons why people fly. Many of those reasons are actually tied up with people's worldview, their sense of themselves, their sense of their privilege and entitlement. Many of them are actually tied up with people's money. The single strongest determinant of whether people fly or not, indeed what their emissions are, is actually their income. Well-off, well-educated, upper-middle-class people will tend to fly a lot more than people who don't have much money. That's the truth of it. But I think what's interesting with the climate change issue is actually how people resolve the dissonance between doing something that they know is directly involved with what's going on. And part of my inquiries on this was I asked somebody, for example, who is a leading economist working with Sir Nicholas Stern, who did, I'm sure many of you know, the Stern Report on the Economics of Climate Change. He flies several times a year to see family and friends in South Africa. And I said, well, how do you square that? And he said, well, what I do is I buy offsets. And when I buy offsets, I send a very powerful message to the aviation industry that the price of carbon is too low. And I said, well, listen, Squire, look, you're a professor in economics, and I ditched it when I was an undergraduate. But you know what? My understanding of economics is actually when you buy a ticket to South Africa, you send out a very powerful economic message saying, give me more flights to South Africa. And the offset is neither here nor there. So what's interesting is that people set up intellectual structures on top of a behavior that they have chosen for a wide range of reasons, including very emotional, social, deep-seated reasons, on which they then structure the basis for why they can or cannot do that behavior. I'm just going to let that sit. It might be an interesting question for us to bring up. And if we do bring it up in the discussion, let's bring it up in a way which is trying to look at the reasons why we do that. And not just because you have to for work, we know that. But there's also a lot of flying behavior we could avoid, so why do we do that? My colleagues in Greenpeace flew, incidentally, for leisure purposes more than any group I've ever met in my life. So they had a lot of swearing, and I'll tell you the reason they did it was because they believed that they had already established a moral offset by the quality of their work. So it's like, when it got to the bottom of it, they believed that actually by doing their bit to save the planet, they had therefore offset their responsibility, any offset for responsibility of how they choose to spend their spare time, which is also very interesting behavior. It's one that we see mirrored in people's personal consumption behavior as well, that there are many people who are high-consuming, high-polluting people who adopt tokenistic behaviors, small tokenistic behaviors, in order to provide a personal moral offset. Intensive recycling, it's definitely a demographic type. I'm going to talk a little bit about our work. That was the first part. Let's talk a little bit about the work. Within Language and Discourse, we're exploring that interface between different groups, between the ways that people work together. And we have a website, talkingclimate.org, in which we are bringing together the current research on climate change, and actually the database that we've taken from the George Mason University, from the Center of Climate Communication, that we are now going to house this database and keep it updated. And this is a partnership between ourselves, Public Interest Resource Centre, which is another organisation based in Wales, and the University of Nottingham in the UK. We are therefore seeking to find a way whereby we can bring, as it were, in our kind of like border territory, bring together climate change expertise with climate change practice and put the two together. We have a newsletter. Please do sign on for it. I also do want to mention the climate access site that we also held that Kara is working on. And in fact, actually, we got into a panic when we saw this because our website was already well advanced. We went, oh my God, someone else is doing it. But actually, that picture's very familiar, isn't it? Look, it's just there. So but we're going to be working closely together, and this is doing very similar work. I think this exchange of information is very, very important to get people out of their silos, to get people from different disciplines talking to each other. Our work on communications is based on a critique. Critique's always good. It's a good start to look at something and say, actually, this is what you should not do. So let's imagine that we were putting together a piece of lousy climate communication. Okay, how badly could we do it? And I would say this is a set of useful criteria for how to do it very badly. We've heard a bunch of this already, and we've heard some of the good evidence base for why this might be the case. Okay, all right. Here's another set of criteria. There you're getting a sense. Okay, all right. And most important of all, this one, whatever you do. Yeah. So, to my astonishment, a while ago, and this was the thing which really led us into our Language and Discourse Program, realizing we really needed to get proactive on this, the British government clearly brought together the leading communications experts in the country to design for them a national advertisement that would meet every single one of those criteria. And I thought you might be interested to see a really lousy piece of communication. Are we ready with sound? Okay.
There was once a land where the weather was very, very strange. There were awful heat waves in some parts, and in others terrible storms and floods. Scientists said it was being caused by too much CO2, which went up into the sky when the grown-ups used energy. They said the CO2 was getting dangerous. Its effects were happening faster than they had thought. Some places could even disappear under the sea, and it was the children of the land who'd have to live with the horrible consequences. The grown-ups realized they had to do something. They discovered that over 40% of the CO2 was coming from ordinary everyday things like keeping houses warm and driving cars, which meant if they made less CO2, maybe they could save the land for the children.
Is there a happy ending?
It's up to us how the story ends. See what you can do. Search online for ACT on CO2.
Okay. I asked them, I asked the people in DEFRA, the Department of Environment, when we got to speak to them about actually what the testing process was for that, and it was remarkably similar to this. They said, yeah, we thought it was really, really good. It's really speaking to people intergenerationally. We had a very interesting discussion yesterday, didn't we, about intergenerational. And there's a real problem with being intergenerational. It's triggering this guilt, and it's simply, this got people's backs up so much. And actually, when I show it to focus groups, I've done a lot of work with trades unions as one of the groups we try and do a lot of work with. When we work with these kind of groups, people just hate it, absolutely hate it. It got pulled. The protest was so strong it got pulled. So there's a critique. So let's look how it actually, that's what not to do. Let's have a look at maybe what we can do. Oh, no, we don't want to see that again. Thank you. Oh, I should add, yes, within the British context, we need to know that mad as a lord is a British phrase, which seems to apply to these two characters. This is Lord Monckton of Benchley, and this is Nigel Lawson, Lord Lawson of Blabby, who are amongst the highest profile British climate change deniers. Monckton, to my horror, being an international celebrity, there he is mucking about looking like a twit. Running an advert in this context to say that climate change is a children's fairy story was extremely ill-chosen. And Britain generates more lies locally than it can export. It's one of the few things we're still a world leader on. And it pumps these things out all around the world. How can we do things better? Well, we have been very active members of a Common Cause working group. And I think this is very interesting. I'd strongly recommend, it's one of the things I recommended to all of you, that you read. We're not the lead organization on this. Full credit has to go to Dr. Tom Crompton of World Wildlife Fund. World Wildlife Fund's their credit supporting this work, which is quite brave of them, I think. The Common Cause working group is looking at how we can build communications around values and frames. Can we do things differently? Can we run climate communications that is not just about saying, save money, quids in your pocket, oh my God, it's the end of the world, we're all going to die? Can we find ways of actually speaking in a better way? And I think what makes the work of Common Cause so interesting is that they want it to be very strongly based in an evidence base, in a research-based evidence base. They're working primarily, I want to get my names right so I don't look like I don't know what I'm talking about. They're working primarily with Shalom Schwartz's work on values, which will be familiar to you because it's been very, very high profile. And this is how that work was arranged by Frederick Grousset as a circumplex. And it's a circumplex which is showing values arranged in opposing values. And for those people who are not familiar with this, I'll quickly say we have heard it mentioned, so people are obviously familiar with it. But these values tend to cluster in what we could call intrinsic values. These are the values which nurture the self and nurture one's sense of community and identity, and the extrinsic, which are very much about the competitive, how does the world see me, and conformity values. And you can see how they're displayed there. The important thing about the circumplex is that there is strong evidence that these values also associate themselves with pro and anti-environmental behaviors. Of course, we heard the presentation from Dan Kahan about how worldview is tied in with people's attitude towards climate science. It's also very strongly related to behaviors. However, the important thing about the values is that they do not reside exclusively with one group or another group, but they're found in all people to varying degrees. That is to say that people who have an extrinsic bias nonetheless have a full range of intrinsic values that can be spoken to and triggered, and vice versa. It means also that when we do communications which goes out and speaks to an extrinsic value, like you can save money on climate change, you can be successful, you can be rich, and so on. When we do that, we nonetheless set up and trigger a set of frames that encourage the extrinsic side of a chart and try and tend to pull people over into behaviors which in other ways are high consumption, high competition, and antithetical to climate change. So the challenge is, can we address the one side in a communication strategy? Now, there's a very interesting debate going on in Britain, and it's a debate which relates to all of this. On the one hand, we have the Common Cause approach. On the other hand, we have what's called CISL, which is also a very interesting report. I recommend it to you by Futerra Communications, who are the lead communications advisors to the British government for many years. I know them well. Sizzle says, actually, the problem with climate communications is it's too drab, it's too dire, it's too miserable, and it's too hopeless. Now, we would definitely agree that apocalyptic messages are problematic. The question is, however, as you can see, laid out here, do we speak to self-acceptance and realism and who we are, or do we speak to an aspirational sense of how great a future could be, and this is who we want to be? And is there some balance between the two of them? Right, here we are then. We have here some of the things I've already touched on. Boundary condition, multi-partner approaches, peer communications in the sense of getting people to speak to people like themselves, very important. Norms of attention, worldviews, values, and frames. Okay, so this is the kind of mix we're working with. Now, the final part is this. Can we apply this new thinking to messaging across an entire country? As an organization, we want to be at this interface between theory and practice, so we were very, very excited when our long-term work advising the Welsh government actually turned into a project. And the project was this. They want to put sustainable development, they intend to put sustainable development at the heart of every single aspect of Welsh government policy from now on, through a bill. Now, the Sustainable Development Bill means it cannot be readily overturned with a change of government. Sustainable development, in their sense, is not just a tick box exercise about, like, are you recycling your plastic bags and you're reusing your coffee cups. It's something much more fundamental about the way that all government services are run, with a view to both their environmental impacts, but also their long-term impacts. Do we invest in health education, which reduces smoking rates in teenagers, or do we invest in lung cancer intensive care? Well, obviously, we try and do the first. But this is very new thinking for governments, because governments usually like to make the short-term decisions rather than long-term decisions. So, we have been brought in to lead the development of what are called narratives, overarching narratives for how these things could be messaged and communicated within Wales. Let's say a few words about Wales. First of all, Wales, the word Welsh, Wales, is actually a word for foreigner. It's an Anglo-Saxon word for foreigner, an outsider. Not surprisingly, then, Welsh people like the word Cymru, which is their own word for who they are. It's a land of great beauty. That was on a relatively sunny day, and we remember it very well. Yeah, September the 21st, yeah. 2008, we were all out there. As well as great natural beauty, it was also at one point the world's largest exporter of coal. The entire infrastructure and history of Wales has been built on the back of fossil fuel extraction. That makes it very interesting. And there's not now a single coal pit in all of Wales, or not a deep coal pit. There are open cast coal pits. It also has an extraordinary language. This is actually the railway station up the road from me. It's rather famous for the length of its name. They actually call it Llanfair PG, just thank God, or else you'd be standing around the railway station waiting for the announcement to end. And as you can see, from that sign there, the language is really quite remarkable. And oh dear, that seems to have fallen off the bottom, but that is actually a photo of a Welsh housing estate which has a healthy life expectancy, that's to say how long you expect to be healthy for, of 58, which is one of the lowest scores in all of Europe. So we have a situation here where, not surprisingly, there's a situation familiar no doubt from in many places in the States, that as a result of the industrial heritage, there is very serious social deprivation. Whoops, I shouldn't do that. A few words about Wales. This is the former extent of Celtic culture before the Romans. The heartland is actually in southern Germany. People got pushed out to the very, very edges. In fact, the metaphor for this is the Asterix books. Has anybody here read Asterix? Okay, the point of Asterix is that a tiny little Gaulish village is still fighting out against the Romans as the last remaining bastion of independence. It's not coincidence that is placed in Brittany, which is, as you will see, the Celtic extreme of the coast of France, where the Celts still managed to survive against the invaders. both Wales and Brittany, their cultures have 2,000 years of being backed against the sea by waves of invaders. This produces a culture which is in many ways extremely defensive in terms of its attitudes towards the outside world. Well, I don't know why it's doing that. It also produces within the language certain words which have very, very powerful meaning related to people's sense of cultural identity. This is why I call this talk Hiraeth and Hearth. Hiraeth, these terms are not readily translatable. Hiraeth, Bodlon, and Cynefin all relate to people's sense of identity, but in ways that are very, very complex and built into the language and culture. So in terms of building values-based, intrinsic modes, we've got a lot to play with.
The energy we waste in Wales produces tons of CO2. Like when we leave the TV on standby, overfill a kettle, or leave a tap running. But we can all do something about it, and save money on our energy bills too. To work out the size of your carbon footprint, and for tips on how to reduce it, visit walescarbonfootprint.gov.uk.
Before we came on, this was the advert that the Welsh government was running. They had apparently consulted the same team of experts that the British Department of Environment had consulted. Small, easy steps, no clearly middle-class home, no association with Wales. It could be absolutely anywhere. Turning off the tap saves well, for brushing your teeth, it's cold water. So in carbon terms, it's you know, I mean, very hard to measure, let's put it that way. And help Wales reduce its carbon footprint. So the narrative they're working with is that you should help Wales reduce its carbon footprint. The reward there is, hey, that's cool. I've helped Wales reduce its carbon footprint. And when they did the research and went out, not surprisingly, they found there was a high level of awareness of the ad. There was no sign that anybody had changed their behavior one iota on the back of it. This was the fashion at the time. This is what we're up against, and this is a chance to rethink what we do. A narrative, this is what you shouldn't do with PowerPoints, by the way, is put up this kind of thing. But narratives, discourse, these are interchangeable terms. It's actually quite complex to say what is a narrative. We have our operating definition, which is actually that it's words. It's words put in, it's words in, a word is the most basic unit. And we are looking at individual words and how words register, building up to entire sentences, entire phrases, and beyond that, entire stories. Entire storylines with beginnings, middles, and ends, with actors, and with actors, with perpetrators and goals. However, a narrative can be broken down to the individual words and components of use. And what they do is they make sense of the world and they carry the meaning. So they're encoded in worldviews, where we are, what our values are, and they express that to us. So our goal with this was how to find these overarching narratives that would actually work. And we have a process that I'd be very happy to share with anyone. And I have to say, first of all, this is an inconclusive piece of work because it is all underway as I speak. And I wanted to show you at least how we deal with this opportunity. First thing is, as a segmentation exercise, we have 6 attitudinal segments, and we're doing 2 focus groups for each. So, everything is going to be tested. And tested more than just passing it around to our mates in the office. I mean, tested to destruction. We're not just testing the narratives, we are starting in all of the focus groups of asking people about their values, their identity, what makes them proud, what upsets them, how they feel about life, and so on. And we're recording every single word of that, and we're going to build the narratives out of the actual language and the words that they use. Very detailed literature review, which once it becomes available, I'm very happy to share with people. A review of the existing narratives and interviews that were very extensive, not just within the government, but also with all possible stakeholders, including a SurveyMonkey form, which I think had 200 individual replies. So we sifted through an awful lot of material. This then distilled down to setting trial narratives, of which I think we broke down in the end to around 40 trial narratives. These trial narratives, we pulled together an expert team in order to pull them together and to say, we're now at the interface between practice and theory, so let's bring together the leading theoreticians in the country. This is a chance to do something, actually you very rarely get this chance to apply something across an entire culture. for discussion groups, that's for focus groups, we can call them discussion groups. And the result of all of this is going to be a toolkit. It is not going to be a brand. It is not going to be, the government, of course, are not going to be hugely thrilled by this, because I'm sure some of them still think they're going to have something they can just cut and paste into their press releases. That is not going to happen. They're going to be getting fragments of language that they can then use and apply. And once the stuff, this is part of a 2-year program, so once it goes out there, that is not the end to it. We are then going to see how it goes down, how it is received, and constantly build on that. Constantly keep testing, retesting, and disseminating to a very wide range of actors so that we're trying to try and get public ownership of this. Narratives Design Workshop has, well, that's Tom Crompton in the foreground, that's Ed Gillespie of Futerra, a number of people there. That's the head of a Welsh tourism board, actually, the guy who's got his hand up there. So we're seeking, in other words, to get the narratives we develop fed into every single aspect of how the country represents itself externally. And here are some of the things we're playing around with. The environment is all around us, so let's prevent this thing of the environment being external. Messengers own the message. We've got to find messages which actually people want to take off and use. The reward, what's the reward of taking action on any of this stuff? It's belonging. We're coming back again to the stuff that Dan was talking about this morning. It's like we need to have a situation where what you believe in and what you do is a statement of who you are. Easier said than done, but at least that's the aspiration of it. And how do we relate to the future? We know people may have a distancing effect of climate change, in particular, they make it in the future, so we have to find a way of saying the future is rooted in the past. And in terms of the role of government, we have to stop the government from saying, we're the leaders in the world on this, and everybody looks at us to say, no, we're modest, we're working on this, we're going to tell you what's hard, and we're going to lead in the areas we need to lead in. So here's some of the results just to end on. This one here, I won't read it out, that's tedious when people do that. But this one here is what we might call an ecological services model. That's to say, the environment, that's to say that the environment is something which serves a purpose for people, but is deeply rooted in a sense of tradition. That's to say, protecting the environment is protecting a part of yourself. Are people all right if I switch on? Yeah. Okay. This is resilience. We're trying this out. This is not usually tried in climate change communications, but we think that this is just, we have a set of about 10 narratives. I'm just going to show you 3 of them. This is saying we are prepared to face up to the problems because we know that the road's going to be tough. Now, you're not supposed to do that in climate change communications. Incidentally, notice none of these mention climate change or sustainable development. Because that is the point. That is the point, is what we're going to do is we're going to build our narratives around these issues on the basis of how people respond to these things. We have to see, is this an issue of protecting? Is that going to work? Or are people going to be turned off by that? Of course, we're also trying one which we could say is the pure sizzle, which is one we've heard several times over the last couple of days, which is the future. It could be really exciting. There could be new technologies. There are big opportunities, opportunity being the big sizzle word. In the focus groups so far, those have bombed. But that might be a culturally specific issue. Okay, this one is interesting. We don't judge progress solely by money and markets. Our real wealth lies in relationships of our friends and families and community. Okay. We even have a word for it, bodlong. These are all out for testing. Let's see. But you can see why it would be nice if this one worked. But let's see if it does. Because in the end, the proof is in the testing. And this is a process-driven issue of how do we lead a process of talking about it. Remember, the communicators have to own the message. So what we have here is we are exploring the idea that this is an open narrative. We do not say, this is where we're going, this is what it looks like, this is great. We're saying, actually, we're on a journey together and we're going to write our own story. It's also opening up the possibility, and we'll have to see how this goes down for government, that we build into the narrative from the very outset the possibility of accepting dissent. That seems to me like a very good idea. But we'll see how the government feels in terms of that. But I think that makes a lot more sense to say that this is a conversation in which we may have our disagreements. Because after all, we're family, and that's what happens in family, but we're all bound by a stronger set of values. Just to say on this, of course, we always have to be careful because we're always like running a kind of, an arms race, as it were, with the other side. Every time we come up with something we think works in terms of values, we have to be aware that it's also being used by other people and being distorted. Here we have a thing that we tell our own story on the subway in New York. I saw that Citibank is also running that story as well. So we always have this issue that we have to be like one step ahead of other people, because as soon as this happens, talking about a journey, talking about writing your story, we have lost any sense of public ownership. It has simply become a marketing cliche. Thank you.